Hey kids, it's Sister Teresa again in the gardens. Last week we left off with Jeremiah being very discouraged because people were laughing at him. And God said, don't worry, I've got this. And they're actually going to be asking you for help pretty soon. So here we are. I haven't told you what Jeremiah means. Jeremiah means to throw or to send. And God was sending his message to the people through Jeremiah. And he was throwing it out there to them just like you would throw a ball to someone. But they weren't catching it. They weren't getting it at all. We know that Jeremiah prophesied to these people for 40 years. And he delivered God's messages faithfully, just like God told him to, even if it meant that the people were going to laugh at him or shun him or even try to kill him. The message that he sent out was directly from God, but the people chose not to catch what he threw out. They didn't like having to discipline themselves to worship the one true living God. They found it much easier to worship the other gods, the pagan gods, who didn't require so much discipline. And the priests and the prophets were leading them into that idol worship, and God didn't like it at all. So God was going to allow them to drink the poison that they were choosing to drink rather than the living water that he had for them. But God didn't like it, and it hurt God's heart. So the first thing that we find this week is that God is going to send a message to the kings of Judah. And the first message that he sends to is Jehoiakim. Now Jehoiakim was in his 4th year of reign, and Jeremiah brought the message that the people of Babylon were going to capture them and keep them in captivity for 70 years. Now this 70 years of captivity was that long a period of time because this was the amount of years that the people had not given God Sabbath rest. They also were supposed to not plant things in the 7th year and to trust that God would bring enough for them to manage without them planting. Not only did God want the people to rest every 7 years, he wanted the land to have a rest as well. And for 490 years, God's people had not obeyed him. And if you divide 7 into 490, you're going to get 70. So those of you that are really good in math are going to get that. I wasn't ever that good in math. I'm so glad that God explained to me how this came about. So they owed God and the land 70 years of Sabbath rest, and God was going to put them in timeout in Babylon, where they couldn't work their own land, but they would be working for the Babylonians. And they also were not going to be in a land where they could worship the one true living God. They were going to be forced to worship the gods of Babylon. But wasn't that really what they were doing when they were getting in trouble? So God was making them do the very thing that they had done that had made him mad. How does that sound to you? So God told Jeremiah to take a cup from his hand. And that cup that he was going to take was going to be God's cup of wrath. And every nation was going to have to drink from that cup of wrath. I'm so glad that we don't have to drink from the cup of wrath that God has any longer. And the only reason we don't have to do that is because Jesus took that cup of wrath for us when he died on the cross. But this was long before Jesus came. And God was telling Jeremiah, I want you to take this cup of wrath and I want you to make my people in Jerusalem drink it. And I want you to take it to all the nations that I tell you to take it to and make them drink it too. And to tell them they don't have a choice. That cup of God's wrath was going to be God bringing the Babylonians against all these people, destroying their countries, destroying them, and taking the people that were left into captivity. It was a most bitter cup that they were going to have to drink. You know, Jesus drank that bitter cup. He did it willingly These people weren't going to be drinking this cup willingly. But Jesus drank that cup willingly because he loved us, and he knew it was the only way that we would be saved from an eternal death and be able to be with him forever. Jeremiah did what the Lord told him to do, and he started with the nation of Jerusalem because that was God's desire to start with his own children. Then he went to Egypt and Uz and the Philistine cities and Edom and Moab and Ammon and Tyre and Sidon, all these surrounding countries of Jerusalem. They were going to have to drink that cup of wrath from the Lord as well because they had not obeyed God about worshiping only him. So in the end, God would be using Babylon to bring this judgment on these other nations, and then he said that he would bring his cup of wrath on Babylon as well. Jeremiah told them to drink, get drunk, and vomit so that they would fall. Now that sounds kind of gross. And if you've ever thrown up, you know that when you throw up, you're so weak, you can't do anything. That was the point. God was going to make these nations so weak, they would never be able to rise up again. No matter what nation had come into power, they were going to fall, even the Babylonians. Only the kingdom of God would last forever and not fall. And these nations had no choice whether or not they were going to drink from that cup of wrath, because all have to answer to God in the end. And God also said that no one was going to survive, everyone was going to perish, and that no one would be buried, and no one would be mourning those that fell. The Lord told Jeremiah to give this message to the people in the courtyard of the temple. And when the priest heard it, they were outraged. They were so angry that they started screaming, "Kill him," especially when Jeremiah said that God was going to do to Jerusalem the same thing he had done to Shiloh. They cried out for him to be killed, and the city officials came to hear what all the commotion was about. Jeremiah stood in the court that the city officials held in his own defense and said, "I haven't done anything but declare what the Lord told me to declare." And there were wise men there that came up and said, "You know, you need to remember when King Hezekiah was approached by the prophet Micah and given a word from the Lord about them and the things they were doing wrong. They repented. They fell on their knees, and the Lord blessed them for that." We need to think about what Jeremiah is saying. And then there was another prophet around this same time named Uriah that had spoken against the people, and the people had killed him with the sword. So there was a man named Ahikam who was the son of Shaphan. Now Shaphan was that man that had read the book of the law to Josiah when Josiah had fell on his knees and repented. And the son of Shaphan, named Ahikam, came up and said, "You know, this is a good man, Jeremiah, and you should not kill him. Don't turn him over to the mob." So the city officials decided Jeremiah was innocent and he would live. The Lord always delivered Jeremiah anytime he got in trouble, and that was exactly what God had said to Jeremiah when he called him to be his prophet and minister to the people. He said he would save him from his oppressors and let no harm come to him. God told Jeremiah to go and speak directly to King Jehoiakim and tell him to make sure that the people were able to hear what he had to say. Jeremiah said God wanted all of them to be fair-minded and just and do what was right, to help those who had been robbed and rescue them from their oppressors, quit their evil deeds and not mistreat foreigners, murdering them, and to treat orphans and widows right. If they would obey God in this, there would always be a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem, and the kings would go in and out of its gates. But if they refused to obey, the whole palace would become a pile of rubble, and the people from many nations would pass by and wonder what in the world happened there. And the answer would be because they have violated their covenant with God and their Lord by worshiping other gods. Jeremiah also told them to stop mourning the loss of their last king, Jehoahaz. King Necho had taken him off to Egypt, and he had died in Egypt, and they liked Jehoahaz. They had put Jehoahaz on the throne, but King Necho didn't think Jehoahaz would do what he would tell him to do, so that's why he put his son, Jehoiakim, on the throne. Necho had taken Jehoahaz in chains and carried him off to Egypt, and he had died, and the people were still weeping, wishing he was back. And Jeremiah said, "Stop weeping over Jehoahaz. Weep over Jehoiakim, because he is going to be taken off as well." King Necho of Egypt had put a heavy tax on Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim had collected this tax from the wealthier people in Jerusalem. Now, the Egyptians were attacked by the Babylonians, and they were defeated at Carchemish. And when this happened, Jehoiakim stopped sending tribute to Egypt and started sending tribute to Babylon. He took all the precious things out of the temple and gave them to Babylon to try to save Jerusalem from being taken captive. Jehoiakim was not a good man. He actually had relationships with his mother and his daughter-in-law and his stepmother. God wasn't happy with that. And he had a habit of murdering men, and then he would take their wives and have his way with them. He also had a whole lot of tattoos on his body, and God wasn't pleased with that. You know, God says in his word that we're not supposed to cut, pierce, or tattoo our bodies, because God created our bodies. They are his. We're not supposed to do anything to deface this temple that God had made. So Jehoiakim continued being a vassal to the Babylonians until they failed when they tried to invade Egypt again. And the area that was in their control around Jerusalem wasn't under their control anymore. So Jehoiakim switched his allegiance from Babylon back to Egypt. And this made King Nebuchadnezzar very, very mad. So 3 years later, he laid a siege to Jerusalem. And Jeremiah came to Jehoiakim and gave him a personal message about himself. He said that sorrow would await him, because when he built his palace, he cared more about his palace than the people that were building it, and he didn't even pay them. And God told Jeremiah to tell Jehoiakim that a beautiful cedar palace did not make a good king. Only obedience to the Lord by doing what was just and right in everything. Jehoiakim only had eyes for greed and dishonesty, because he murdered and oppressed the innocent and the poor, and he reigned ruthlessly. The message said that the people would not mourn for him because he was not a good king, and that he would be buried just like a dead donkey, dragged out of the city and dumped outside the gates in the heat of the day and the frost of the night. Actually, King Nebuchadnezzar had him bound in fetters to carry off and to be taken to Babylon, but he died before that siege was over. A man named Josephus, that was a scribe, wrote that Nebuchadnezzar slew Jehoiakim along with all the high-ranking officials in Judah, and commanded Jehoiakim's body to be thrown over the walls without any burial. So Jeremiah's message came true that he spoke to Jehoiakim. Jeremiah then gave a message for Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, that then took the throne. He said the Lord would abandon him, just as if he was a signet ring on his right hand. He would pull it off of his right hand. That's exactly what he did. He said he would hand him over to those who sought to kill him, Nebuchadnezzar and his mighty Babylonian army. Jeremiah told him he and his mother would be expelled from the land, and he would die in a foreign country and never return to the land that he so yearned to be coming back to. He was going to be like a broken, discarded jar, and his children would be exiled because of his failure to be a godly king. Jeremiah said that the records would show that Jehoiakim was childless. Actually, Jehoiakim had children that did come back to Jerusalem when God brought the children of Israel out of exile, and Jesus Christ's lineage actually came through Jehoiakim. But there would never be a son of Jehoiakim that would sit on the throne of David and rule Judah. 3 months after Jehoiachin came on the throne, Nebuchadnezzar deposed him, fearing that he would avenge his father's death by revolting. And Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's younger brother, which was actually Jehoiachim's uncle, took the throne in place of him as king. Jehoiachin, his mother, his household, and much of Judah's population was exiled to Babylon during this siege, as well as many other people that did artwork and craftsmen. Daniel and his friends and another prophet named Ezekiel was also deposed at this time and taken to Babylon. And God gave Jeremiah a vision of 2 baskets. One was a basket of good fruit. It was a basket of figs. And he said, you know what, Jeremiah? All these people that I've just deported to Babylon, they are represented by this basket of good fruit. Now, figs was what he was talking about. I don't know if y'all have ever seen a fig or eaten a fig before, but they're very sweet. They're very good to eat. And God said that those I've just sent to Babylon are good fruit. Daniel is good fruit. Ezekiel is good fruit. But all those people that are left behind in Jerusalem, Zedekiah and his officials, all of his leaders, all the priests and prophets that were left in Jerusalem, I gotta chew this up. They're bad figs. They're rotten through and through to the core. And I'm not going to accept them. I'm not going to deliver them. And they're all going to be destroyed. They're good for nothing. And they're going to be scattered because they're going to align themselves once again with Egypt, and they're going to resist the Babylonians. They were disobedient in their idolatry, and Jeremiah was coming to tell the people not to resist the Babylonians when they come to take them in captivity, because that's the only way they were going to live. Jeremiah spoke to the leaders of Judah and told them how much sorrow awaited them, as they were the appointed shepherds that were supposed to be looking after God's sheep, but they had destroyed and scattered the very ones that they had been expected to care for. They had deserted them, driving them into destruction, and God would pour out his judgment on them for the evil they had done. Now, these were the leaders that were left in Jerusalem. He said that he would gather the people that were in Babylon back as his remnant from the countries where he had driven them and bring them back to their own sheepfold. And they were to be fruitful, and they were going to increase in number. And at that time, God would appoint good shepherds, responsible shepherds who would care for them, and the people would never again have to be afraid. And God would make sure that not one sheep was lost. This was a prophetic announcement from Jeremiah about the coming Messiah, Jesus. Jeremiah said the time was coming when the Lord would raise up a righteous descendant from King David's lineage, and he would be a king who would rule with wisdom. He would do what was just and right throughout the land. And his name would be called Jehovah Sitkanu. This means Jehovah is our righteousness. In that day, Judah would be saved, and Israel would live in safety. Jeremiah, of course, was talking about Jesus. And Jeremiah said, in that day, the people would say, as surely as the Lord lives, who rescued the people out of Israel from the land of Egypt, would change the way that they sealed an oath. And instead they would say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the people of Israel back to their own land from the land of the north and from all the countries to which he had exiled them. That would be the way that they would make an oath from then on, because they would relate to the people coming back from the north much better than they would relate from when God brought the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. So that would be the way they would seal an oath in the days that God would bring them back. Jeremiah then turned to the prophets, saying, his heart was broken and his bones were trembling, and he was staggering like a drunkard or somebody overcome with wine, because the holy words that the Lord had spoken against them. Jeremiah said the land was in mourning and the pastures were all dried up because of how they had abused the power God had given them. They were supposed to be coming before the Lord and getting a word from the Lord and then giving it to the people. But instead, they were telling the people things that would benefit them. And they were charging the people money for it. God didn't like that at all. Both the priest and the prophets were doing this, and they were very ungodly. They were wicked men who had done horrible things right in the temple of the Lord. And God said that they would walk on paths that would become slippery, and they would be chased through the dark and fall, because the Lord would bring disaster on them at the fixed time of his punishment. God said the prophets of the northern kingdom in Samaria were evil because they had prophesied in the name of Baal. But he said the prophets were in Jerusalem were worse than the prophets of Samaria, because they had encouraged the ones they were supposed to instruct in righteousness to do all kinds of evil deeds, and that they were worse than the Sodom and Gomorrah that he had destroyed many hundreds of years before. God said he was going to feed them bitterness and give them poison to drink. He said the reason the wickedness had filled the land so bad was because the prophets of Jerusalem had led them into sin, and the priest had led them into sin. Jeremiah was instructed by God to tell the people not to listen to the prophets, because those words were not from the Lord. You know, we listen to people lots of time that are not speaking from the Lord. And they lead us down a path, and we drink poison on that path, and we slip and we fall, just like Jeremiah was telling these people that they were going to be doing. God's anger was not going to diminish until it was completely finished. And Jeremiah told them they would understand sooner or later. Actually, he told them they would understand soon what God meant when he said he would not stop his anger until it was completely finished. God said to Jeremiah to tell these people that these prophets were saying that they had dreams from the Lord, but their dreams weren't really coming from the Lord. Jeremiah said the Lord's word was like a fire that consumes, or a mighty hammer that smashes a rock to pieces. And these false prophets were not portraying God correctly. Jeremiah said if a prophet came up to them and said, I have a burden from the Lord for you, that they were supposed to reply, "No, you are the burden to the Lord." The prophets were say they had a burden to speak when they wanted people to believe what they were saying really came from the Lord, and to get the people to listen to them and follow what they said. But Jeremiah said the Lord would abandon anyone who said those words, that they had a prophecy from the Lord that wasn't really from the Lord. He said the people should ask the Lord if what the prophets were saying were true before they started following it. The Lord said, when somebody comes up to you and said, "I have a prophecy for you from the Lord," that they should say, "The Lord said he was going to abandon you for speaking prophecies that he never spoke," and that was the only thing the people should say back to these prophets. Jeremiah was trying to give the people words to say to the false prophets whenever they would open their mouths, because whenever they would open their mouths, they were always saying something that was a lie. Our story of Jeremiah now moves to the reign of Zedekiah in Judah. We've learned how Nebuchadnezzar killed Jehoiachin and appointed Zedekiah king over Judah because Nebuchadnezzar believed that he would be loyal to Babylon. God was warning Zedekiah through Jeremiah of the sorrow that was going to come to him during his reign because of the disobedience that was in his heart. God gives Zedekiah a living example by telling Jeremiah to take a wooden yoke and put it around his neck like an oxen would have put around his neck when he was pulling a plow or a wagon. That oxen would only be able to move in the way that the one driving the cart or driving the plow would allow the oxen to move. And if the oxen tried to move in a way that the driver didn't want him to, he would get his whip on his back. So God was trying to show Zedekiah and all the people in Jerusalem that if they did not surrender to the yoke that Babylon was going to put on their necks and go willingly with them, they were going to get whipped as well. Actually, they were not going to be able to live. And the only reason they were going to be able to live in Babylon is if they went willingly. So Jeremiah goes to the temple and he's got this yoke around his neck. And he's telling everybody, if you don't surrender to the Babylonians with the yoke they're going to put around your neck, you're not going to live. So there's this other man that comes up. And Jeremiah is telling the people what God said. And God said, I want to tell you exactly what he said. With my great strength and powerful arm, I've made the earth and all its people and every animal subject to King Nebuchadnezzar. And I can give these things of mine to anyone that I choose. And I'm giving all your nations to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon because he is my servant. And I have put everything, even the wild animals, under his control. All the nations are going to serve him, his son and his grandson, until his grandson's time is up. Many nations and great kings will conquer and rule over Babylon at that time, because I'm going to bring them over Babylon, and Babylon is going to be crushed for crushing everybody else. But he says, I will put your neck under Babylon's yoke, and I will punish any nation that refuses to be his slave with war and famine and disease upon them until Babylon has conquered them. Sometimes God would tell the prophets to act out a message to get it deeper into the people's hearts, and that's what was happening right now. Jeremiah was before them with a wooden yoke around his neck, symbolizing the yoke that God would allow Babylon to put on their necks, and they would have to submit to Babylon or suffer the consequences. Jeremiah was competing with all these other false prophets in Jerusalem who were telling them that the gold articles that had been taken away from the temple in Jerusalem were going to be brought back because Babylon had carried them away. Their prophecies were lies, and they were distracting the people from the truths that Jeremiah was bringing from the Lord. God was trying to prepare the people by telling them the Babylonians were coming, and if they would surrender, that they would live. But the people didn't want to hear what Jeremiah was saying. Jeremiah said it would be better for these false prophets that were saying, peace, peace, this is not going to happen. It would be better if they would spend their time going before the Lord and asking the Lord what the truth really was. If it is it is the belief that all these things that were taken out of the temple in Jerusalem and carried to Babylon, that the Ark of the Covenant was not among these things. And I want to say something about that, because it's Jewish belief that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden by Jeremiah in the tunnels that were underneath the temple. And God says in His Word that He will reveal all truth to us. So at just the right time, I believe that God's going to let us know if the Ark of the Covenant is actually, in fact, buried underneath where the temple was in Jerusalem. But right now, these prophets are saying that all these things that were carried off to Babylon are going to be brought back. Jeremiah says, that's not true. In that same time frame, there was another prophet named Hananiah, and he was from a place called Gibeon. And he faced off with Jeremiah in the middle of everyone and said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm going to take this yoke off of you, Jeremiah. And he bashed it on the ground and broke it into pieces. And he said, I'll tell you what's going to happen. The Lord gave me a message. The Lord said that within 2 years, all these things that Babylon took away from the temple, all these precious utensils, they're going to be brought back. Even Jehoiachin is going to be brought back. And it's not going to be the way that Jeremiah is talking about. Jeremiah just walked away, walked out of the temple. And then God gave a message to Jeremiah to take to Hananiah. And He told him this in private. He said, you know, what you said to the people is not true. And because they believed you, this is what God says. You destroyed the wooden yoke that was around my neck. But there's going to be an iron yoke that's going to come upon all the people of Jerusalem. And it's going to be put on there by Babylon. And they're not going to be able to take it off. And you're not going to be able to take it off. And because you spoke lies to the people about what I was trying to say to them, that God was saying to me, you're going to die. And you know what? Within 2 months, Hananiah died. God's word always comes true. God said that in order for a prophet who spoke of peace to be known true, their prophecies had to come true. And Jeremiah said to Hananiah, all these prophets that have been set by God to come and speak to the people have all talked about destruction and the bad things that were going to happen. And you come up saying, peace, peace, peace. Well, what God said was going to happen to Hananiah happened, just like everything God said comes true. It would be important for us to remember that God also says in His Word, if you speak against one of God's anointed, you're going to have consequences. It would be good for us to remember that, not be talking bad about those that God has sent to spread His Word, like our preachers and prophets and teachers, those that we know of that are speaking God's Word. So God then directs Jeremiah's attention to the exiles in Babylon, and He tells Jeremiah to write a letter to them. And in this letter, He says, during that time in your captivity, you need to plant gardens, just like the gardens I've planted here. And you're supposed to eat the fruits from those gardens. and you're supposed to marry, and you're supposed to have children. And I want you to marry your children off so that you can have grandchildren. I want you to prosper, and I want you to pray for Babylon, because if you pray for Babylon, then things are going to be good for Babylon. And if things are good for Babylon, then they're going to be good for you in Babylon. I want you to be fruitful and multiply, because I'm going to bring you back to Jerusalem after your 70 years of captivity. And I want a good remnant to bring back. So do what I'm telling you to do. Pray to the Lord for Babylon's welfare, even though you don't want to, even though they're the ones that have taken you into captivity. Jeremiah then writes the well-known phrase, "For I, the Lord, know the plans that I have for you, plans for good and not for evil, plans to prosper you." That's what Jeremiah was trying to say. Jeremiah warned them not to listen to the prophets that would arise during their captivity. Those prophets' names were Ahab and Zedekiah. They were going to be telling the people that opposite things of what Jeremiah was saying. And they actually told a man named, let me get it here, Shemaiah, that Jeremiah had written this letter telling the people in captivity to plant gardens and prosper and marry and have children. And Shemaiah wrote a letter to another prophet that we studied about a couple of weeks ago named Zephaniah. And he said, you know, you've got the responsibility as priest to put people in chains that are going around acting like crazy men, saying that God's going to destroy Jerusalem. And you need to put Jeremiah in chains. You need to have him shackled. But Zephaniah took the letter straight to Jeremiah and said, do you see what this man is writing? He's trying to get you in trouble again. Here's another time that God redirects someone that's trying to harm Jeremiah. Jeremiah spoke a curse on Shemaiah and his family and all of his descendants and said, you will never be able to see the good things that God is going to give to his people when he brings them back to Jerusalem. And you're not coming back to Jerusalem either. You know, we would do well to remember that God has us protected and covered also. God loves us, and he knows what he's doing when he says to trust him, that he's got our backs and he's taking care of us. That's my prayer for you today, that you remember that God's got your back just like he had Jeremiah's back, and he's going to take care of you no matter what comes in front of you. And if enemies are coming in front of you, pray for them, because God has told us to pray for our enemies. Next week, we're going to continue in the book of Jeremiah and learn more about what God is asking him to do during his ministry, and learn more about the judgments that God's going to bring upon the nations. Until that time, y'all be well. And remember, God's got your back.